I think that Ilia hits like a truck, and so does Gaethje, and I think if Gaethje prepared.
This wasn't just a fight, no matter how badly people want to reduce it to one. It wasn't just 5 rounds, a belt, a decision read off a card by a man in a suit under blinding lights. This was a rupture, a violent snapping point in the lightweight division that felt less like a sporting outcome and more like a warning shot fired across the bow of the entire organization. Because everything we thought we understood about the hierarchy, about inevitability, about who was untouchable and who was merely passing through, all of that fractured in a single night. And the most unsettling part is that the cracks had been there long before the first punch was ever thrown. Most people just didn't want to see them. For months, the narrative had been airtight. Paddy's rise wasn't just impressive, it was marketed as unstoppable. He had the backing of a crowd, the confidence that bordered on arrogance, and the kind of self-belief that feeds itself every time it goes unchallenged. Inside the inner circle, among the analysts and the diehards, there was a quiet assumption that this was simply the next chapter in a reign that would stretch on until the division bent around it. Even the doubters framed their skepticism as hypothetical, as something that might happen someday against someone else under different circumstances. Nobody truly expected the floor to collapse that night. Nobody expected the lightweight division to wake up the next morning feeling like it had survived an earthquake. But inevitability is a dangerous illusion in this sport. It has a way of evaporating the moment pain enters the equation. And pain was everywhere that night, thick in the air, woven into every exchange, every grimace, every desperate breath taken between rounds. By the time the cage door closed, this was no longer about rankings or future matchups. It was about survival, about ego, about 2 men realizing in real time that the story they thought they were writing was slipping out of their control. The weigh-ins should have been the first warning. Paddy didn't just talk, he declared. He promised violence with a smile, said he was going to knock Justin out tomorrow, like it was a foregone conclusion, like the result had already been agreed upon by fate. To some, it sounded like confidence. To others, it sounded like someone who had never truly been forced to confront the worst possible outcome. That distinction matters more than people realize, because fighters who haven't made peace with loss often react to it in unpredictable ways when it suddenly becomes real. Justin, on the other hand, didn't need to sell anything. His reputation did the talking for him. A man who had been through wars, who had tasted defeat and carried it with him, who understood that nothing in that cage is guaranteed no matter how many people believe in you. He wasn't there to play a role in someone else's coronation. He was there because he needed to be, because winning had stopped being automatic, and because coming off losses has a way of stripping you down to the essentials. When he spoke afterward about taking winning for granted, it wasn't a soundbite. It was a confession, the kind that only comes from someone who has felt the ground fall away beneath them. And when the fight began, it became immediately clear that this wasn't going to follow a clean script. There was no cautious feeling-out process, no respectful distance maintained for the sake of strategy. The moment they touched gloves, something primal took over. Justin didn't just advance. He marched forward with a kind of intent that compresses space and suffocates opponents before the damage even accumulates. Every step carried weight. Every movement screamed that he was there to impose himself, not react. Paddy's low kicks weren't defensive gestures. They were calculated attempts to dismantle that forward pressure, to slow the engine before it could reach full speed. And for a moment, it looked like it might work. The sound of those kicks echoed, dull and heavy, the kind that linger in the nerves long after the round ends. But Justin's right hand was always lurking, coiled and patient, hunting for the opening that inevitably comes when 2 men refuse to give ground. The crowd felt it before it fully happened. You could hear the shift, the collective intake of breath, when that overhand right finally came whipping through, carrying everything behind it. Technique stopped being the focus almost immediately. This was about will, about who was willing to walk through fire and who might hesitate just long enough to get burned. And then the first knockdown came, brutal and undeniable. Justin smelled blood and reacted the way predators do, swarming without hesitation, without calculation, driven by instinct alone. When Paddy somehow rolled, scrambled, and found his way back to his feet, only to be kicked back down again, the mood changed. This wasn't thrilling anymore. It was alarming. The line between competition and something far darker started to blur, and you could feel people around the arena realizing it at the same time. That's when things began to unravel in ways that don't show up neatly on highlight reels. Justin started throwing with a kind of recklessness that felt intentional, almost defiant. Defense became optional. He ducked into shots, ate punches that would have stopped lesser fighters cold, as if absorbing damage was part of the statement he was trying to make. And in the middle of that chaos, the eye poke happened. Clear, blatant, impossible to miss. What followed was one of the strangest reactions of the night. The crowd booed, but not the way you'd expect. The noise wasn't aligned with the infraction itself. It was confused, misdirected, almost angry at the interruption rather than the act. And that's when the atmosphere cracked. Because controversies don't explode instantly. They form when confusion meets convenience, when chaos creates cover. Round 2 only intensified everything. Justin swung with such raw power that he was nearly knocking himself off balance, while Paddy's uppercuts kept finding their mark, sharp and mechanical, like a piston firing again and again. And still, Justin refused to slow down. Pain didn't deter him, it offended him. He responded to every clean shot by throwing harder, by pushing forward, by daring his body to fail him. This is where the whispers started. People close enough to see details others couldn't. People who notice things that cameras don't always capture cleanly. Glances exchange cage side. Expressions that lingered just a little too long. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, but enough to plant seeds that would grow later, long after the noise faded. Justin's body kicks were savage, thudding into Paddy's midsection with a force that would send most fighters retreating. Then the right hand started landing cleaner, snapping heads back, forcing adjustments. And when one finally connected flush, the look on Justin's face wasn't fear or desperation. It was calculation. Cold, deliberate, almost unsettling. That's the look fighters get when they decide that winning matters more than their own safety. When Paddy was forced down and Justin dove into dangerous territory, willingly stepping into upkicks to continue the assault, it felt like the night was teetering on the edge of catastrophe. This was no longer controlled violence. This was a man betting everything on momentum, trusting that his body would hold together just long enough. Paddy survived the round, but survival came at a cost. Blood painted his face, swelling distorted features, and yet he kept coming back out, round after round, refusing to disappear. The third round opened like a cruel joke, with Paddy being dropped again almost immediately, as if the fight itself was trying to eject him. And then, impossibly, he stood up again, shaking it off like it was nothing. That moment mattered more than people realize. Because Justin's volume dipped just enough afterward, just enough to create space. Fatigue, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, began to creep in. And that tiny shift, barely perceptible in real time, became the fault line everything else would eventually break along. Leg kicks started landing more consistently. Jabs found their range. Then came the knee to the cup. Accidental or not, it froze the fight, halted momentum, allowed bodies to reset. When they restarted, Paddy looked fresher. Justin looked irritated. And irritation has always been a dangerous companion for him inside the cage. The championship rounds felt almost voyeuristic, like something you weren't supposed to be watching. Both men were visibly exhausted, yet still throwing with intent, still finding ways to hurt each other. Justin emptied himself, throwing everything he had left, while Paddy's counters punished every reckless entry. The toughness on display was absurd, almost inhuman, but toughness can mask imbalance. What we were really watching was two systems breaking down at different rates. By the fifth round, the crowd had gone feral, feeding off the violence, riding every exchange like a wave. And then, it happened again. Another knee, another sickening cup shot. This time Justin collapsed, clutching himself, agony written across his body. Time seemed to stop, and somewhere in that stillness, a realization formed that this ending was going to age strangely, that people would revisit it with different eyes once more information surfaced, once questions started to be asked in earnest. When the scorecards were read, the numbers landed like a verdict not just on the fight, but on the story itself. 48 to 47, 49 to 46, 49 to 46, unanimous for Justin. Clean on paper, complicated in reality. Because scorecards don't just record rounds, they frame narratives. And this narrative came with footnotes no one wanted to read out loud yet. They called it Fight of the Year almost immediately, and in many ways, it deserved the praise. It was savage, emotional, unforgettable. But true classics don't usually come wrapped in this much discomfort, this many asterisks, this sense that something important was left unresolved. And that's the part that refuses to go away. The silence afterward. The way certain people stopped talking when they should have been explaining. The way the lightweight division suddenly felt less stable, less certain, like it had absorbed a shock it hadn't yet processed. Because divisions remember nights like this. Fighters remember perceived injustices. Commissions remember paperwork. And if even a fraction of the unease surrounding this fight proves justified, then this result didn't settle anything. It delayed something far bigger. This fight didn't end. It stopped. And the pressure has been building ever since. The days immediately after the fight were louder than the arena itself. But the noise was deceptive. Social media exploded with clipped highlights, slowed down knockdowns, grainy freeze frames of moments taken out of sequence and stripped of context. Everyone suddenly became a judge, a referee, a doctor, a moral authority. But beneath that surface-level chaos, something far more interesting was happening in the quiet rooms where decisions actually get made. The lightweight division didn't just move on. It stalled. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Matchmakers hesitated. Fighters who were supposed to be next started circling each other without committing, like animals sensing a storm before the clouds even form. Because when a fight ends cleanly, the future rushes in to fill the vacuum. When it doesn't, the past refuses to let go. Justin wore the belt, but it sat heavy. You could see it in the way he spoke afterward, the way his answers drifted between pride and defensiveness. He insisted he won every round that mattered, insisted he didn't feel the shots, insisted that damage was one-sided even when the evidence on his own body suggested otherwise. This wasn't trash talk. This was a man trying to convince himself, as much as anyone else, that the story made sense. Fighters know when something is off, even if they can't articulate it without sounding ungrateful or paranoid. Paddy, meanwhile, didn't explode the way people expected. No wild accusations. No scorched earth interviews. That restraint confused people more than rage ever would have. He spoke about unfinished business, about needing to watch the tape, about accepting outcomes, while clearly not accepting the implications. That kind of composure after a war like that isn't peace. It's compression. Pressure sealed inside, waiting for the wrong moment to escape. And then there was the commission. Officially, everything was fine. Fouls were addressed in real time. Medical checks were passed. Paperwork was filed. But commissions don't exist in a vacuum. They operate under scrutiny, under precedent, under the understanding that certain fights demand more explanation than others. When you have repeated fouls in pivotal moments, when momentum shifts align too neatly with interruptions, questions don't go away just because the final horn sounded. Behind closed doors, reviews were requested. Not dramatic investigations, not headline-grabbing probes, but quiet requests for clarification. Timelines, angles, referee reports. The kind of administrative digging that never makes it into hype videos but has derailed careers before. At the same time, the rest of the division watched closely. Fighters are selfish by necessity, but they are also deeply perceptive. They know when a title picture is stable and when it's vulnerable. And suddenly, nobody knew what the roadmap looked like anymore. The interim belt conversation felt hollow. Unification talk sounded premature. Even the looming presence of Ilia Topuria, the man everyone agreed was a nightmare matchup for either of them, started to feel like an intrusion into a story that hadn't finished its second act yet. That's the thing about chaos. It doesn't stay contained. Whispers grew louder. Not claims, not accusations, but questions. Why did certain moments go unchecked? Why did the referee allow the pace to spiral the way it did? Why did the crowd reaction seem to influence the flow more than it should have? None of these questions alone prove anything. Together, they create an atmosphere where certainty can't breathe. And uncertainty is poison for a division built on hierarchy. Justin's physical condition became another quiet focal point. He insisted he was fine, brushed off concerns, but insiders noticed the pauses. The way training updates slowed. The absence of hard timelines. A fight like that doesn't just tax the body, it fractures rhythms. Recovery becomes unpredictable. Small injuries linger. Confidence wobbles in places fighters don't like to admit exist. If he needed time off, the belt stalled the division. If he pushed through, the risk compounded. Either way, the structure everyone relied on began to wobble. Paddy's camp, on the other hand, went almost silent. No rushed rematch demands. No public pressure campaigns. That silence felt deliberate, like a chess player refusing to tip their hand. Because the more this fight got replayed, the more moments stood out that didn't age cleanly. Not because they proved anything definitively, but because they resisted simple explanation. Momentum shifts are supposed to feel organic. These didn't. They felt interrupted. Fans started noticing patterns. Analysts who initially brushed off the fouls as incidental began softening their language. Unfortunate. Impactful. Worth discussing. Language matters. It's how narratives evolve without anyone having to admit they were wrong. And then the talk of Topuria returned, louder this time, but different. Less inevitability, more menace. Because suddenly, he wasn't just the next challenger. He was the looming consequence. The man who could erase all this ambiguity by doing what he does best, ending fights cleanly, violently, without debate. But even that solution felt wrong to some. Like skipping a chapter. Like rewarding chaos instead of resolving it. This is how divisions fracture. Not with explosions, but with hesitation. With competing truths. With fighters unsure whether they're chasing belts or ghosts. Justin's victory tour never fully materialized. No victory lap that felt earned without caveats. Every interview circled back to the same moments, the same questions, the same need to defend what should have spoken for itself. Champions aren't supposed to sound like lawyers, but that's what happens when outcomes feel provisional. Paddy, meanwhile, became a symbol whether he wanted to or not. To some, he was the embodiment of grit, of survival, of refusing to fold even when the night tried to erase him. To others, he was the beneficiary of chaos, the man who stayed alive long enough for controversy to take root. Neither label fit comfortably, and that discomfort followed him everywhere. The division watched. The fans argued. The organization recalculated. Because here's the uncomfortable truth nobody likes to say out loud. When a fight generates this much noise after the fact, it changes matchmaking philosophy. Risk tolerance shifts. Promoters become cautious. Referees become tighter or looser in response. Fighters adjust their strategies not just to opponents, but to officiating patterns. The sport subtly reshapes itself around moments like this. And that's why this fight mattered far beyond one night. It introduced doubt into a system that depends on clarity. It reminded everyone that violence alone doesn't resolve narratives. Sometimes it complicates them beyond repair. As weeks passed, the pressure didn't dissipate. It concentrated. Every update, every rumor, every vague statement added weight to the sense that the lightweight division was holding its breath. Something had to give. A rematch announcement. A medical suspension revelation. A rules clarification. Anything to break the tension. But nothing came. And in that silence, resentment fermented. Fighters felt overlooked. Contenders felt stalled. Fans felt manipulated. The division became a pressure cooker with no release valve, the lid rattling but refusing to blow. The fight that was supposed to crown clarity had instead exposed fragility. And once fragility is visible, it can't be unseen. Because deep down, everyone involved understood the same uncomfortable reality. This wasn't over. Not emotionally, not structurally, not narratively. The night ended, the belts were handed out, but the story kept moving in the dark, reshaping itself in ways no one fully controlled anymore. And the longer it stayed unresolved, the more dangerous the eventual reckoning became. By the time the noise reached its peak, the people who mattered most weren't speaking at all. That's always how you know something is wrong. When the loudest arguments are happening online while the decision-makers retreat into silence, it means the system is trying to protect itself. And protection, in this sport, rarely looks clean. Inside gyms across the world, lightweight contenders watch the tape on loop. Not for entertainment, not for inspiration, for answers. They slowed it down, frame by frame, searching for patterns. Not just in the exchanges, but in the reactions, the pauses, the resets, the moments where time bent in subtle ways that didn't align with the violence unfolding inside the cage. Fighters notice things fans don't. They have to. Their lives depend on it. And what they saw made them uneasy. It wasn't about who landed more. It wasn't even about who should have won. It was about consistency. About whether the rules that govern chaos were applied evenly, or whether the chaos itself had begun to dictate the rules. When repeated fouls intersect with momentum shifts, when referees hesitate instead of intervene, when the crowd's reaction seems to echo louder than the official's voice, something fundamental breaks. Trust. Justin trained, but not the way champions usually do. The intensity was there, but the urgency felt muted, like a man running drills while waiting for a phone call that hadn't come yet. You could see it in his posture during open sessions, in the way he talked about what's next without ever naming it. Fighters thrive on clarity. Uncertainty erodes them from the inside out. He had won, yes, but he hadn't silenced anything. Paddy's camp, still quiet, began laying groundwork in less visible ways. Conversations with matchmakers. Questions phrased carefully, framed as concerns rather than complaints. No accusations, just requests for explanation. And those explanations, when they came, were vague, procedural, unsatisfying. That's when the tension crossed a line. Because dissatisfaction doesn't need a villain to grow. It only needs ambiguity. The organization found itself in a bind. Publicly acknowledging controversy risks delegitimizing a result. Ignoring it risks something worse, erosion of credibility. So they did what institutions always do in moments like this. They delayed. They redirected. They floated alternative narratives. A different contender. A different timeline. A future that didn't require reopening the past. But the past refused to stay buried. Commentators who initially praised the fight began adding caveats. Analysts started saying things like context matters, and there were moments that deserve a second look. Former fighters, people who had lived through similar nights, spoke more freely. They talked about how fouls change fights even when they aren't intentional. How pain doesn't just interrupt momentum, it rewires decision-making in real time. And suddenly, the fight wasn't just being debated. It was being reinterpreted. Justin bristled at that. Understandably. To him, every question felt like an accusation. Every pause in praise felt like an attempt to steal something he'd earned in blood. But defensiveness has a way of amplifying doubt rather than dispelling it. The harder he insisted the night was clean, the more people revisited moments that suggested otherwise. Paddy, meanwhile, became harder to define. He wasn't claiming injustice, but he wasn't conceding closure either. He spoke about growth, about lessons, about coming back better. But there was an undercurrent there, a sense that he believed the story wasn't finished, even if he wasn't ready to say how. The division fractured along invisible lines. Fighters who relied on pressure, fighting, began questioning officiating standards. Counter-strikers wondered how much chaos they could safely navigate before it turned against them. Everyone adjusted their calculus. And then the medical whispers started. Nothing official. Nothing headline-worthy. Just quiet concern. Lingering damage. Recovery taking longer than expected. Justin's body had absorbed an incredible amount of punishment, and while he downplayed it, people close to the situation noticed the signs. Reduced sparring, modified training, careful language around timelines. A champion who can't commit to a defense isn't a champion who stabilizes a division. Topuria's name resurfaced again, but now it felt less like a solution and more like a threat. A wrecking ball waiting outside a cracked foundation. Bringing him into the picture without resolving the existing tension risked collapsing everything at once. Yet keeping him out risked stagnation. No option felt clean anymore. And that's when the first real crack appeared in public. A referee interview. Harmless on the surface. Reflective. Measured. But buried within it was an admission that stuck out to anyone listening closely. A moment where the pace got away. A moment where intervention might have been handled differently. Nothing damning. Nothing definitive. But enough. Enough to validate the discomfort. The lightweight division had reached a point where pretending this was just another fight became impossible. It had changed how people talked about enforcement, about safety, about the thin line between letting fighters work and protecting them from themselves. And the irony was brutal. The fight was being celebrated as a testament to toughness, while simultaneously serving as an indictment of how much toughness the sport demands without always knowing where to draw the line. As the weeks turned into months, something else became clear. The resentment wasn't just between camps. It was spreading outward. Fighters felt trapped by uncertainty. Fans felt manipulated by narratives that no longer matched what they were seeing. The organization felt pressure from all sides. This is how reckoning begins. Not with a scandal, but with accumulated unease. Because the truth is, fights like this don't just exist in the past. They influence behavior going forward. Referees hesitate differently. Fighters push boundaries differently. Matchmakers hedge differently. And the next controversial moment is always shaped by the last one that went unresolved. The lightweight division had entered a new phase, one defined not by dominance, but by doubt. And doubt is contagious. Eventually, silence stops being neutral. It becomes a statement all its own. And by the time the lightweight division reached that point, everyone could feel it. The waiting wasn't passive anymore. It was charged. Fighters weren't just standing by, they were recalibrating entire careers around the absence of clarity. Camps that had planned for one path suddenly found themselves hedging against 3 or 4 possible futures, none of them clean, none of them guaranteed. Behind the scenes, meetings stretched longer than they should have. Conversations circled without landing. The same names came up again and again, always followed by pauses. You don't need transcripts to know when confidence is missing. You can hear it in what doesn't get decided. Justin's camp wanted assurance. Not just about the next opponent, but about the legitimacy of the ground he was standing on. Being champion is supposed to come with leverage, with momentum. Instead, it came with conditions, medical updates, internal evaluations, careful phrasing about readiness that felt more like stalling than strategy. Every day that passed without a definitive announcement made the belt feel less like a crown and more like a question mark. Paddy's position was even more complicated. He wasn't demanding a rematch, but he wasn't walking away either. That in-between space is dangerous. It allows narratives to grow unchecked. Some framed him as the uncrowned moral victor. Others accused him of benefiting from chaos, while playing innocent afterward. Neither version captured the reality, which was far more human. He had gone through something brutal, something that changed how he saw the sport, and he was trying to understand what it meant before deciding how to respond. But the sport doesn't wait for understanding. Contenders below them grew restless. Careers have expiration dates, and nothing accelerates resentment like watching the top of the mountain stall. Fighters started calling for eliminators, for interim titles, for anything that would force motion. Each call added pressure. Each demand chipped away at the illusion that the division was still orderly. the organization tried to redirect attention. Other weight classes, other storylines. But the lightweight division has always been a gravitational center. When it destabilizes, everything else feels slightly off balance. And then came the first visible contradiction. An interview seemingly routine, where an official praised the fight's intensity while simultaneously acknowledging the difficulty of officiating bouts that escalate that quickly. It wasn't an admission of failure, but it was a concession of strain, an acknowledgement that the system had been pushed to its limits. That's when people stopped asking whether the fight was controversial and started asking what it revealed. Because the deeper issue wasn't fouls or scorecards. It was the reliance on chaos as spectacle. The willingness to let moments spiral because they generate excitement, because they make for unforgettable nights, even if they create long-term instability. This fight became a mirror held up to the sport, and not everyone liked what they saw. Justin, watching this unfold, found himself in an impossible position. Any defense of the fight made him sound defensive. Any silence made him seem complicit. Champions are expected to project certainty, but certainty was the one thing unavailable. His body still carried the fight. His mind carried the aftermath, and the division carried the consequences. Paddy, meanwhile, began subtly shifting tone. Not louder, but sharper. More precise. He spoke about standards, about consistency, about protecting fighters while letting them fight. Still no accusations. Still no direct challenges. But the message was clear to anyone paying attention. This wasn't about one night anymore. It was about precedent. And precedent is power. The fans, sensing that something was being withheld, grew more polarized. Every clip became evidence. Every pause became suspicious. The debate stopped being about who won and became about whether the system itself could be trusted to handle moments like this without compromising its integrity. That's when the first real fracture appeared inside the division's hierarchy. A contender publicly questioned whether winning a title even meant the same thing anymore. It wasn't framed as bitterness. It was framed as confusion. And confusion, coming from someone with nothing to gain by stirring controversy, carried weight. The lightweight division had reached a point where too many people were asking the same question from different angles. When that happens, answers become unavoidable. Pressure mounted quietly but relentlessly. The kind that doesn't explode, but compresses. And compressed systems fail suddenly, without warning. Everyone could feel that a decision was coming. Not necessarily the right one. Just one that would force the story forward. A fight announcement. A medical suspension. A ruling clarification. Something to release the tension. But whatever came next was never going to resolve everything. It was only going to expose how deep the cracks really went. Because the truth, the one nobody wanted to confront, was that this fight had already done its damage. Not to reputations alone, but to confidence in the process. And once that confidence erodes, restoring it is far harder than winning any belt. The lightweight division wasn't waiting anymore. It was bracing. When the decision finally came, it didn't arrive with clarity. It arrived with force. Not the clean, decisive kind that settles debates, but the kind that pushes problems forward without resolving them. The organization announced its next move with the confidence of finality, but the reaction exposed just how fragile that confidence really was. On paper, it looked like progress, a path forward, a way to keep the division moving. In reality, it felt like an evasion. A deliberate sidestep around the unresolved core of the controversy. And almost immediately, the response told the story the announcement couldn't control. Justin's name was there, but the framing mattered. Conditional language, pending timelines, health clearances emphasized more than ambition. The belt was present, but it no longer anchored the narrative. It hovered, symbolic rather than authoritative. Paddy's absence from that announcement was louder than any inclusion could have been. No acknowledgement of unfinished business. No reference to the fight that had fractured the division in the first place. It was as if the organization hoped enough forward momentum would erase backward scrutiny. It didn't. Fighters reacted first. not emotionally, but strategically. Camps adjusted schedules. Potential opponents reconsidered risks. Some openly questioned whether the title picture now required political navigation as much as physical readiness. That kind of thinking doesn't belong in a sport built on competition, but once it enters, it's hard to remove. Paddy finally spoke in a way that cut through the noise without raising his voice. He didn't demand anything. He didn't accuse. He simply stated that clarity mattered, that fighters deserve to know the standards they're being judged by, that moving on without addressing what happened only ensures it will happen again. That statement landed heavier than any rant ever could have. Justin responded, but the edge was there now, the patience thinning. He spoke about toughness, about fighting through adversity, about how this sport isn't supposed to be clean. And he wasn't wrong, but the framing missed the point. Nobody was asking for cleanliness. They were asking for consistency. The fans felt it immediately. The division split into camps that no longer spoke the same language. One side celebrated resilience at all costs. The other questioned whether resilience was being used as a shield to avoid accountability. Neither side trusted the other, and both believed they were protecting the soul of the sport. That's how fractures deepen, not through villains, but through incompatible values. Behind the scenes, the pressure spiked. Media requests increased. Talking points were distributed. Interviews became more guarded. The organization tried to hold the line, emphasizing excitement, violence, entertainment. But the subtext kept leaking through. Questions about officiating standards, about fighter safety, about how much chaos is too much. Because once those questions are asked publicly, they don't disappear. Justin's training updates remained vague. The absence of concrete dates fed speculation. Was he hurt more than admitted? Was the fight's toll deeper than visible? The uncertainty undermined the authority that championships rely on. A champion must feel inevitable. This one felt provisional. Paddy's next move became the focal point. Would he accept a different fight? Would he push for a rematch? Would he step away until clarity emerged? Every possibility carried implications not just for his career, but for the division's credibility. And then something subtle but significant happened. Another fight in another division featured a similar foul. The referee intervened instantly. The enforcement was strict. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Fans noticed. Fighters noticed. Analysts noticed. Comparisons flooded in, and suddenly, the question wasn't hypothetical anymore. Why was this handled differently? No official explanation satisfied everyone. The variability was framed as human judgment, situational nuance. But nuance doesn't comfort fighters whose livelihoods depend on predictability. It unsettles them. The lightweight division now had a reference point, a visible inconsistency that validated months of discomfort. And once validation arrives, restraint disappears. Calls for transparency grew louder. Not outrage, not rebellion, just insistence. Fighters wanted guidelines. Fans wanted explanations. Media wanted accountability. The story had outgrown the organization's ability to steer it quietly. And still, no one admitted fault. Not because of arrogance, but because fault implies liability. And liability opens doors no one wants to walk through. So the division moved forward with unresolved weight dragging behind it. Every announcement felt heavier. Every fight felt like a potential flashpoint. The environment had changed. What was once just a brutal, unforgettable war had become a stress test the sport hadn't fully passed. And everyone knew it. Because the most dangerous thing about this moment wasn't that people were angry. It was that they were paying attention, closely, critically, relentlessly. And once that happens, nothing gets a free pass ever again. By the time the lightweight division reached its breaking point, there was no single moment you could point to and say, this is where it all went wrong. That's the most unsettling part. The damage wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. Layer upon layer of unresolved tension, quiet compromises, and decisions made to preserve momentum instead of meaning. And when the consequences finally surfaced, they didn't arrive as scandal. They arrived as inevitability. The first sign wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. A delay, not a cancellation, not a withdrawal, just a postponement framed as precautionary. Medical evaluations ongoing. Timelines under review. Language carefully chosen to sound responsible while revealing almost nothing. But fighters understand subtext better than anyone. A delay at this level doesn't just suggest caution. It suggests uncertainty about what happens next if the wrong move is made. Justin's body had become part of the story, whether he liked it or not. Every update was parsed, every image scrutinized, every vague statement treated like a clue. He insisted he was fine, insisted he'd be ready. But the insistence itself betrayed the pressure. Champions don't usually need to reassure people this much. They just show up. Paddy, watching from the outside now, wasn't chasing headlines. He didn't need to. The narrative had started bending toward him on its own. Not as a victim, not as a robbed fighter, but as the embodiment of unfinished business. Every time the division stalled, his absence from the center of it all felt louder. And that's when the mood shifted. Because once enough time passes without resolution, people stop asking for answers and start forming conclusions. Fighters began speaking more openly, not about the fight itself, but about trust. About whether they believed outcomes would always be protected if they were inconvenient. About whether chaos was being rewarded simply because it sold. Those questions landed hard. The organization responded the only way it could, by accelerating plans, forcing motion. Announcements came faster. Matchups were floated with less build-up. The goal was momentum, not reflection. But acceleration in a destabilized system doesn't create clarity. It creates stress fractures. And then the division felt it. A contender declined to fight publicly, citing uncertainty around the title picture. Another accepted a bout, but openly questioned what it would lead to. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of self-preservation. Fighters adjusting to a system they no longer fully trusted. That's when it became clear this fight had done something rare and dangerous. It had changed behavior. The lightweight division had always thrived on brutal honesty. Win and you advance. Lose and you recalibrate. Now, that simplicity was gone. Outcomes felt provisional. Context mattered too much. History weighed heavier than usual. Justin, still champion in name, found himself defending more than a belt. He was defending a night. A process, a system. Every question about the future dragged him back to the past. And no matter how many times he said he'd moved on, the sport hadn't. Paddy, meanwhile, didn't need to push. Time was doing the work for him. Every delay, every hedged announcement, every inconsistency reinforced the same idea. This wasn't settled. It was shelved. And shelves break under enough weight. The final shift came quietly, almost anticlimactically. A rules clarification. A memo. Language tightening around fouls, around enforcement, around intervention thresholds. It was framed as evolution, as learning. But everyone understood what prompted it. You don't rewrite rules because everything went smoothly. That clarification didn't name the fight. It didn't need to. The subtext was obvious. The night had forced reflection, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. And reflection is an admission that something slipped. By then, the division was irreversibly changed. Future fights would be officiated differently. Fighters would take fewer risks in certain moments and more in others. Referees would intervene sooner or hesitate longer, depending on the memory that haunted them most. The ripple effects would stretch far beyond the original competitors. That's the legacy nobody talks about. Not the belt, not the scorecards, not even the controversy itself. The way one night recalibrated an entire ecosystem. This wasn't a clean ending, because it never could be. Real fractures don't resolve neatly. They reshape the structure around them. The lightweight division didn't explode. It evolved under pressure, carrying the scar forward. And scars matter. Because every time a fighter steps into that cage now, especially at the highest level, they're doing so in a division that remembers. A division that learned something uncomfortable about itself. A division that knows chaos can't always be controlled once it's unleashed. That fight didn't just stop being filmed when the final bell rang. It kept going. In hesitation, did I end silence? Did I end altered decisions and tightened rules? Did I end the way people talk more carefully now and trust a little less freely? And someday, when another moment like this arrives, because it always does, people will look back and realize this was the night the lightweight division crossed an invisible line. Not into scandal, not into collapse, but into something far more complex. A future where nothing is ever quite as simple as it used to be. And that's where this story finally leaves us, not with closure, not with a clean answer, but with a question mark that still hangs over the lightweight division like a low, unshakable fog. Because long after the blood was washed off the canvas and the belts were packed away, the aftershocks kept moving. They showed up in delays, in changed language, in tightened rules, in fighters hesitating where they once charged forward without a second thought. This wasn't just a war that fans will argue about for years. It was a moment that quietly altered how the sport polices itself, how fighters protect themselves, and how much faith we place in outcomes we're told are final. Maybe Justin won fair and square. Maybe Paddy's resilience was simply extraordinary. Maybe the chaos was just the price of two men refusing to give an inch. Or maybe, just maybe, this was one of those nights that exposes how thin the line really is between legendary and questionable, between letting fighters fight and letting things slip too far. The uncomfortable truth is that all of those things can exist at the same time, and that's exactly why this fight refuses to stay in the past. So now I want to hear from you. Did this fight settle anything in your eyes? Or did it crack the lightweight division wide open? Do you think the controversy is overblown? Or do you believe something important was never fully addressed? And most importantly, what do you think happens next when a division built on chaos starts questioning how much chaos it can afford? If you enjoyed this deep dive and want more long-form, story-driven breakdowns like this, the kind that don't rush to judgment and don't shy away from uncomfortable details, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because trust me, this story isn't the last time the lightweight division will force us to ask hard questions.